Hey guys, tonight we're diving into why you wouldn't last a night in ancient Rome brothel. Forget everything Hollywood told you. This is the real story, and trust me, you probably wouldn't last a day. So before you get too comfortable, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, and let's jump in. Picture this. You've just stepped off a creaky wooden cart after a bone-jarring journey through the Roman countryside. Your back aches, your clothes are dusty, and you're desperately looking for somewhere to stay the night in the sprawling metropolis of Rome. Circa 50 CE. The sun is setting, casting long shadows through the narrow streets, and you can hear the distant roar of the Colosseum crowd. But here's the thing. Hotels as we know them didn't exist. No Hilton, no Holiday Inn, no continental breakfast. Your options were limited. Crash at a friend's house, sleep rough in the streets with the beggars and criminals, or find yourself at a hospitium, a combination inn, tavern, and brothel, all rolled into one chaotic, dangerous package. And that's where our story begins. You push through the heavy wooden door of what looks like a respectable establishment. The smell hits you first. A nauseating cocktail of unwashed bodies, cheap wine, rancid olive oil, and human waste. Remember, this is 2,000 years before deodorant, antibiotics, or basic sanitation. The Romans might have built incredible aqueducts, but personal hygiene? That was more of a suggestion than a requirement. The main room is dimly lit by flickering oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the cracked walls. The smoke from these lamps burns your eyes and throat. There's no ventilation system, no windows, just a cramped space filled with the worst cross-section of Roman society you can imagine. Drunken soldiers stumble around, their armor clanking. Merchants argue loudly over dice games. Prostitutes, both male and female, advertise their services with practiced smiles that don't reach their eyes. And in the corner, a group of gladiators fresh from the arena sit nursing their wounds and cheap wine. You're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. You're in the underbelly of the greatest empire in history, and it smells like a medieval music festival porta-potty. Let's talk money for a second. You've got a few denarii in your pouch, the equivalent of maybe 20 in today's money. A night's accommodation might cost you 2 to 3 denarii, but that's just for a straw mattress in a shared room. Want privacy? That'll be extra. Want a woman? More extra. Want to survive the night without getting robbed, stabbed, or worse? Well, that's not really guaranteed at any price. The average Roman brothel worker, let's call them by their Latin name, meretrices, earned about 2 denarii per client. Some charged as little as 1 denarius, roughly the cost of a loaf of bread. Yeah, you heard that right. Human intimacy valued at less than your morning bagel. But here's where it gets really dark. Most of these women weren't there by choice. They were slaves, captured in wars, sold by desperate families, or tricked into the life with false promises. The Romans had a saying, "Every woman is a prostitute, except my mother and my sister." Classy, right? The building itself is a testament to Roman engineering, And I mean that in the worst possible way. You're staying in what's essentially a 3-story death trap. The ground floor houses the tavern and the cheapest rooms. The second floor is for better clients, and I use that term loosely. The third floor is where the more expensive courtesans entertain wealthy patrons. The walls are thin, like paper thin. You can hear everything, every conversation, every transaction, every violent altercation. And trust me, there will be violent altercations. The Romans didn't exactly have a customer service department for dispute resolution. Your room is maybe 6 by 8 feet. The bed is a wooden frame with a straw mattress that's probably older than you are. The straw is infested with lice, fleas, and God knows what else. There's a chamber pot in the corner that hasn't been emptied in days. The window is just a hole in the wall with a cloth covering. No glass, no shutters, just a flimsy barrier between you and the chaos of the Roman streets. Let's talk about your fellow guest, shall we? In the room next to you, there's Marcus, a disgraced senator who lost his fortune in bad investments. He's drowning his sorrows in cheap wine and cheaper company. His family has disowned him, and he's one step away from selling himself into slavery. Across the hall, you've got Gaius, a deserter from the legions. If he's caught, he'll be crucified. But right now, he's spending his last few coins on wine and women before turning himself in. The stress has driven him half mad, and he talks to himself all night. Downstairs, there's a group of gladiators from the local school. They're not the glamorous heroes Hollywood shows you. They're mostly slaves and criminals, scarred and broken men who fight for the entertainment of the masses. They drink to forget that tomorrow they might die in the arena. And then there are the women. Oh, the women. They come from all corners of the empire. Celtic slaves with haunted eyes, Egyptian girls sold by their families, Germanic prisoners of war who don't even speak Latin yet. They're trapped in a system that sees them as nothing more than commodities. As darkness falls, the real party begins. The wine starts flowing more freely, and with it, the inhibitions drop. You're trying to mind your own business, maybe grab a quick meal before retiring to your luxury accommodations upstairs. But the atmosphere is getting more volatile by the minute. The Romans didn't have television or smartphones to keep them entertained. Their nightlife was raw, unfiltered human drama. And in a place like this, where desperate people gather, that drama quickly turns dangerous. A fight breaks out at the dice table. Someone's been cheating, and now there's blood on the floor. The tavern keeper, a massive ex-gladiator named Brutus, tries to restore order with a club. But the violence is just getting started. You notice the women sliding quietly toward the exits. They know what's coming. They've seen this play out before. When Roman men get drunk and angry, people die. Here's something they don't teach you in school. If you got injured in ancient Rome, you were basically screwed. There's no hospital to rush to, no ambulance to call, no antibiotics to fight infection. The best you could hope for was a medic who might cauterize your wounds with a hot iron and give you some opium to dull the pain. The mortality rate for even minor injuries was astronomical. A simple cut could turn septic and kill you within days. And in a place like this, where violence was common and hygiene was non-existent, death was always just one bar fight away. You see a man in the corner who's been stabbed in the shoulder. He's trying to pack the wound with dirty cloth, but blood is seeping through. Nobody's helping him. In this world, weakness is death, and showing concern for a stranger is a luxury most people can't afford. Let's add another layer of complexity to your night. You probably don't speak Latin. Even if you do, the Latin spoken in Roman brothels wasn't the elegant language of Cicero or Virgil. This was street Latin, crude, fast, and peppered with slang from across the empire. The prostitutes speak in a mixture of languages. You might hear Greek, Germanic dialects, Celtic tongues, and regional variations of Latin, all in the same conversation. Communication often happens through gestures, coins, and violence. And here's the kicker. Literacy was rare. Maybe 10 of the population could read and write. So all those romantic love letters you see in movies, pure fiction. Most relationships were transactional, brief, and brutal. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Disease. In ancient Rome, sexually transmitted infections were rampant and untreatable. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other diseases spread like wildfire through the brothels. There were no condoms, no antibiotics, no concept of sexual health. Women who worked in these establishments rarely lived past 30. They died from disease, violence, suicide, or the complications of frequent pregnancies. The Romans practiced infanticide and abortion, but both were dangerous procedures that often killed the mother. The life expectancy in general was brutal. If you made it to 30 in ancient Rome, you were doing well. If you made it to 50, you were practically a miracle. And if you were working in a brothel, well, let's just say retirement wasn't really an option. Think the police are going to help you if something goes wrong? Think again. Roman law was complex, but it basically boiled down to this. If you were a citizen, you had some rights. If you were a slave or a foreigner, you had none. The vigiles, Rome's equivalent of police, were more like a fire department than law enforcement. They dealt with fires and major disturbances, but a simple assault or robbery in a brothel, that was your problem to solve. Justice was often a matter of personal revenge. If someone wronged you, you either dealt with it yourself or hired someone to deal with it for you. The concept of calling 911 didn't exist. You were on your own, the owner of this establishment. Let's call him Lucius, is what we'd call a pimp today. But in Roman society, he was a legitimate businessman. He owned the building, the slaves, and took a cut of every transaction. He might also loan money at predatory interest rates, sell illegal goods, or run underground gambling operations. These men were often incredibly wealthy, but they were also social outcasts. Romans had a complex relationship with prostitution. They used it constantly, but looked down on those who profited from it. Lucius could never hold public office or marry into a respectable family, but he could afford a lifestyle that most citizens could only dream of. The economics were brutal. A slave woman might service 10-15 clients per night, earning 20 to 30 denarii. But she saw none of that money. It all went to Lucius, minus the costs of food, shelter, and the occasional visit from a back-alley doctor. So how do you survive the night in this hellhole? First, keep your head down. Don't make eye contact with anyone who looks like they're looking for trouble. Don't flash your money around. Don't get involved in games of chance. And whatever you do, don't insult anyone's honor. Second, find allies. The women working there know the layout, the dangerous customers, and the escape routes. They've survived longer than most in this environment, and they might help you if you treat them with respect. Third, stay sober. I know it's tempting to drink away the horror of your situation, but alcohol makes you vulnerable. You need your wits about you to navigate the complex social dynamics and avoid the numerous pitfalls. Fourth, watch the exits. Know where the doors are and keep your belongings packed and ready to go. Sometimes the best strategy is a strategic retreat. The psychological atmosphere in these places was toxic. Everyone was desperate in their own way. The soldiers were desperate for human connection before potentially dying in battle. The merchants were desperate for profit in a cutthroat economy. The slaves were desperate for freedom or death. This desperation bred violence, but it also created unexpected moments of humanity. You might see a hardened gladiator sharing his last piece of bread with a sick prostitute, or a wealthy merchant paying for a woman's freedom just because she reminded him of his daughter. These moments of kindness were rare, but they were what kept people sane in an insane world. The Romans had gods for everything, including prostitution. Venus was the goddess of love, but there was also Priapus, the god of fertility and male sexuality. Many brothels had small shrines where people would leave offerings for protection or good luck. But Christianity was beginning to spread through the empire, and with it came new ideas about sexuality and morality. The early Christians viewed prostitution as a sin, but they also preached redemption and forgiveness. Some of the most dramatic conversion stories involve prostitutes who left their old lives behind. This religious tension added another layer of complexity to an already complicated social situation. Assuming you survive the night, and that's a big assumption, you wake up to a scene that would make a fraternity house look like a monastery. Bodies are scattered around the main room, some sleeping, some unconscious, some possibly dead. The smell is even worse than the night before. You check your belongings. If you're lucky, you still have your money and your clothes. If you're not, well, welcome to ancient Rome, where theft was a way of life and insurance didn't exist. You stumble outside into the morning sun, and the contrast is jarring. Regular Romans are going about their daily business, buying bread, heading to work, taking their children to school. It's like you've stepped out of a nightmare into the real world. But here's the thing. This nightmare was part of the real world. It was the dark underbelly of the greatest civilization in history, and it was as Roman as the Colosseum or the Forum. See, we can't talk about Roman brothels without understanding the broader context of Roman society. This was a civilization built on slavery, conquest, and exploitation. The same engineering genius that built the Pantheon also built the infrastructure for human trafficking on an industrial scale. The Romans conquered vast territories and enslaved millions of people. They brought these slaves back to Rome, where they were bought and sold like cattle. Some ended up in mines, some in gladiator schools, and some in brothels. It was all part of the same system. And here's the really uncomfortable truth. This system worked, at least from an economic perspective. Rome became the most powerful empire in history, partly because it was so efficient at exploiting human labor. The wealth generated by this exploitation funded the armies, the buildings, and the culture that we still admire today. To understand why the brothels were so brutal, you need to understand the status of women in Roman society. Roman women had more rights than their Greek counterparts, but they were still considered property. They couldn't vote, hold office, or control their own money. Upper-class women were expected to be chaste, obedient, and invisible. They existed to produce legitimate heirs and maintain the family honor. Lower-class women worked in shops, taverns, and brothels, but they were still subject to male authority. The women you met in the brothel were at the bottom of this hierarchy. They were often foreigners, slaves, or the daughters of criminals. They had no legal protections, no social safety net, and no hope of escape. The men who frequented these establishments came from all walks of life. Soldiers on leave, merchants traveling for business, young men exploring their sexuality, and older men seeking companionship or adventure. Roman culture celebrated male sexuality while condemning female sexuality. Men were expected to be sexually active and dominant. Virginity was prized in women, but mocked in men. This double standard created a massive demand for prostitution. But many of these men were also victims of the system. Young soldiers faced death in battle. Slaves had no control over their lives, and even free men struggled to make a living in a competitive economy. The brothel was both an escape and a trap. The Romans were incredibly advanced in many ways, but they used their technology to make oppression more efficient. They built roads that made it easier to transport slaves. They created legal systems that codified inequality. They developed military tactics that made conquest more effective. In the brothels, this efficiency was evident in its architecture. The buildings were designed to maximize profit while minimizing escape opportunities. The rooms were small and easily monitored. The layouts funneled customers through in an orderly fashion. Even the payment systems were optimized. Tokens were used instead of coins to speed up transactions and reduce theft. Everything was designed to extract maximum value from human misery, but people fought back. History is full of slave rebellions, from Spartacus to countless smaller uprisings. Women found ways to resist their oppression, sometimes through subterfuge, sometimes through direct action. In the brothels, resistance took many forms. Women might form alliances to protect each other. They might poison abusive customers or help each other escape. Some even organize strikes or work slowdowns. The most famous example is the story of Theodora. who rose from prostitute to Empress of Byzantium. She used her position to pass laws protecting women and outlawing forced prostitution. It was a rare victory in a system designed to crush the powerless. The Roman Empire eventually fell, but not because of moral decay, as some historians claim. It fell because of economic instability, military overextension, and political corruption. The same forces that created the brothels also created the conditions for collapse. As the empire crumbled, the infrastructure of exploitation began to break down. Roads fell into disrepair, making the slave trade more difficult. Legal systems collapsed, creating chaos, but also opportunities for freedom. The rigid social hierarchy began to loosen. Christianity spread throughout the empire, bringing new ideas about human dignity and moral responsibility. While the church had its own problems, it did provide an alternative to the brutal materialism of Roman culture. So what can we learn from this dark chapter in history? First, that progress is not inevitable. Civilizations can be technologically advanced and culturally sophisticated while still being morally bankrupt. Second, that exploitation is always rationalized by those who benefit from it. The Romans convinced themselves that slavery was natural and that some people were born to serve others. They created elaborate philosophies and legal systems to justify their cruelty. Third, that resistance is always possible. Even in the most oppressive systems, people find ways to maintain their humanity and fight for freedom. Before you get too comfortable thinking this is all ancient history, remember that human trafficking still exists today. According to the International Labor Organization, there are more people in slavery today than at any point in human history. Modern brothels in many parts of the world share disturbing similarities with their Roman counterparts. The same economic forces, the same power imbalances, the same human cost. The technology has changed, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. The difference is that today we have international laws, human rights organizations, and global communication networks. We have the tools to fight back, but we need the will to use them. Now, after walking through this nightmare scenario, ask yourself, how would you have survived? What would you have done differently? How would you have maintained your humanity in such an inhumane environment? These aren't just historical questions, they're moral ones. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social systems. They remind us that the capacity for both cruelty and kindness exists in every society, including our own. The Romans weren't monsters. They were people living in a system that rewarded exploitation and punished compassion. The scary part is how easily we might have adapted to that system if we'd been born into it. One thing that struck me while researching this topic was how easy it is to dehumanize people from the past. We read about Roman prostitutes as statistics or plot devices, not as real people with hopes, fears, and dreams. But they were real. They had names, families, stories. They loved and lost and struggled to survive just like we do. The only difference is that they lived in a time and place that offered them fewer choices and less hope. This empathy is crucial because it helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time. When we see people being exploited or marginalized, we need to remember that they're not statistics. They're human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Stories like this one, uncomfortable as they are, serve an important purpose. They help us understand the past, but they also help us understand ourselves. They force us to confront difficult questions about power, morality, and human nature. History isn't just about dates and names and battles. It's about people trying to survive and thrive in the circumstances they were given. Some of those circumstances were brutal, but people found ways to endure and even find meaning in their lives. That's why it's important to tell these stories honestly, without romanticizing or sensationalizing them. The truth is powerful enough on its own. As the sun rises over the Roman Forum, casting long shadows across the marble columns, you realize you've survived something that would have broken most people. You've seen the worst of human nature, but you've also seen glimpses of resilience, kindness, and hope. The women who helped you navigate the night, the men who shared their food and protection, the small acts of humanity in an inhumane place. These are the stories that don't make it into the history books, but they're the ones that matter most. You leave that brothel forever changed. You've seen what humans are capable of when systems fail and desperation takes hold, but you've also seen what we're capable of when we choose compassion over cruelty, humanity over profit. The Roman Empire fell over 1,500 years ago, but the lessons from that night in the brothel are still relevant today. We still struggle with inequality, exploitation, and the dehumanization of the vulnerable. We still have to choose between our better angels and our worst impulses. But here's the thing, we do get to choose. We can learn from the past without being doomed to repeat it. We can build systems that protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. We can choose empathy over indifference, justice over profit, humanity over power. The question isn't whether you would have survived a night in an ancient Roman brothel. The question is, what kind of world are you building today? What legacy are you leaving for future generations to judge? Because someday, someone will look back at our time and ask the same questions we're asking about the Romans. They'll wonder how we could have known so much about human rights and dignity while still allowing exploitation and suffering to continue. The answer to that question is being written right now, in the choices we make and the actions we take. The Romans had their chance to build a better world, and they chose empire over empathy, conquest over compassion. We have our chance too. Let's hope we choose more wisely. So what do you think? Could you have survived that night? More importantly, what are you doing to make sure people don't have to survive nights like that today? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video made you think, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the dark corners of history. Because understanding the past isn't just about satisfying our curiosity. It's about building a better future. Remember, history isn't just something that happened to other people in other times. It's the story of humanity, and we're all part of that story. The question is, what chapter are you writing? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.